Hello, and thank you to what will be a Battle of the Atlantic and escorts run through of the comments and response to the comments. Now, I'm going to do a little bit something different as well, because I'm going to start off by advertising something. These are some of the designs you will find on Spreadshirt, and you will note there is a Blackburn one there. And there is a link to Spreadshirt down below. This has given rise to another family bet. And you always remember that the original bet with my aunt was whether I would get to a certain number of subscribers. Well, she has now made something which is even more tangible than bragging rights online. She has said that if I, by the end of the year, that is by December the 31st, 2021, I get to 13,000 subscribers, which is going to depend mainly on you and a lot of you clicking down there and clicking the subscribe button. She, my uncle, will both be pictured wearing this design, that is the Blackburn face masks. Possibly I'll persuade her to do something other than face masks, but face masks are what she's currently agreed to. And I've also added that in the nicest way in the picture. I'll be wearing it one as well. So, that's there, if I get to 13,000 subscribers. So, we'll see. If it happens, the picture will be taken and will be posted on Sunday the 2nd of January when there's the first brew ships after New Year. Anyway, more importantly, on to the questions. And of course, I'm going to start off with the questions under the redo because that was in the order it's posted. And this should just click through while I'm doing it. So it has no real bearings of the content, but it's there. All the slides for the 2 PowerPoints are there. Anyway, or rather the 3 PowerPoints are there. So, starting off with the first comment we have, that was done, and there were a lot of comments on this. Aegis Flow, thank you. So, Hieroglyph. There's no way Germany could construct 8 battleships and 2 CVs, plus half a dozen heavy cruisers, and build 1,000+ U-boats. I seriously doubt, even if no U-boats were built, that Germany could have managed more than 2 to 4 new battleships and 1 to 2 carriers, maybe 1 to 2 light carriers. There's just not that much shipbuilding capacity. U-boats, in contrast, Germany could and did build them in massive numbers. Well, the point I would make is, for starters, that's the Draken FL plan, so if you want to take that up, please take that up with him. Secondly, although, frankly, I do, to an extent, agree with him, if they had focused in on literally just building Scharnhorst and just churning them out, instead of the delay of developing and getting a new something going, that could have helped them build more. But they would have had to build a lot more facilities, and it's kind of like what they had to do to build the numbers of submarines they built. They had to grow their infrastructure and their capacity for building submarines. The only reason they get as many out as they do is because they grow it dramatically. So they don't have that capacity. This is, again, one of the things. We know Germany produces thousands, well, hundreds, a couple of thousand of submarines during World War II. So people often ask me the question, well, why wasn't the Royal Navy building masses of escorts in the 1930s in response to this? Well, because the Germans took time to build up to it. As I think one of the graphs showed, Germans didn't have that many operational submarines at the beginning of World War II. The Royal Navy was responding to the threat it saw. And honestly, the threat it saw it was managing were Japan, Italy, and Germany, and it wasn't sure which one was going to blow up first, and you need different things to fight different ones. The forces you need to fight Japan are not the same forces you need to fight Germany. And they can't afford to build their navy to fight Germany. I know that's defense of the home islands, but they can't, because that will mean they're abandoning the empire, and the British government will never let them do that. So they're in a constant rock and a hard place. And to be honest, the bigger ships are more useful fighting Japan than Germany, because Germany, theoretically, this is, of course, pre-World War II, when the Royal Navy didn't think Germany would manage to get control of France and Norway, or actually either of them, Neither of that was in the Royal Navy's pre-war strategic plannings. It was probably in their nightmare scenarios, but they didn't think it would happen. No one seriously thought France would crumble the way it did, and no one thought Norway was quite as unprepared as it turned out to be. Life happens. Next question. Hieroglyph. Battle of Atlantic was the best bad option. It was the only chance to keep the USA out of war by blocking all merchant traffic. If you could ever actually block merchant traffic, that's the point, and we'll be getting into this because more people do refer to this at several points. Yes, I agree, the Battle Atlantic is the best option for the Germans, but there is a reason I put forward the suggestion I did about what was actually a viable force for it. Hieroglyph. Graf Spee shows why the surface raider concept was flawed. So did Bismarck. Surprisingly unexpectedly, the Hilfskreuzer were more effective than any other surface raiders. Well, yes, they were, because they were able to hide more, but they were even slower. The problem with the Graf Spee is it's a half-hearted surface raider. In the nicest way, you don't build a surface raider which is more powerful than pretty much any single cruiser, but then you make it slow enough that any group of cruisers can converge in a pack, and B, a battle cruiser can hunt it down and go, whoa, hey! You know, the Graf Spee has a top speed of brain freeze 28.5 knots. There is not a single British cruiser which can't outpace her. There is not a single British. There are actually British battleships, and I'm not talking about the really fast King George V's Vanguard or Hood, which of course is a battle cruiser. I'm talking about some of the upgraded Queen Elizabeths could probably catch her in the right weather. That's not a surface raider. That is the Deutschland class cruiser. There is a reason why the surface raider idea I'm talking about when I talk about a surface raider for the Germans is as fast as it is, because it needs to be able to get away from the enemies, especially when they start hunting it down, because otherwise they're on borrowed time. Right, Student Aviator. Don't forget a few other things. 1, when you sink a surface ship, it almost never loses 100% of its crew. 2, submariners are hard to train. Once the submarine is gone, so too is the veteran crew. I think I did say that, but if I didn't, then I skipped that part of my notes. Ben Wilson. The British Merchant Navy lost a higher percentage of its crews than did the Army, Royal Navy, or Air Force. Well, Student Aviator's response to that is a good point. That fact cannot be forgotten. But the stats are this. That the Officer of the Registrar General of Shipping, Office of the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen, postulated roughly 150,000, 144,000. There is some discrepancies in those figures. Merchant seamen serving aboard British registered, and remember that's the important point, British registered merchant ships at the outbreak of World War II in 1939. And this number would increase to roughly 185,000 to possibly 200,000 during World War II. Again, there is some discrepancy in the figures because it depends whether you're including British registered seamen on British registered ships, or whether you consider Commonwealth seamen British, and I would consider them, so I'm going with the large numbers. Of this number, and especially if we go with the 185 to 200,000, roughly 37,000 seamen are lost when in the action. Nearly 6,000 are taken prisoner, and nearly 5,000 were wounded, totaling in roughly actually 47,000 once you take out all the things I've added up and the things I've added down, roughly 47,000. Which is a casualty rate somewhere in the region of 25%. And Gabe Thomas, who was the former Register of Shipping and Seamen for Great Britain, stated 27% of merchant seamen died through enemy action. Now, by no means were these all veteran seamen, and I know it's very rare for whole crews to be lost. And there were cases, though, where large numbers of crew were lost in one chunk, but usually it was a lot less. That's terrible losses for the merchant seaman. It is. And it's terrible losses to go through, and I can number family members in that, and I can number families on members on the naval side. But there is also the fact that the overwhelming number of people did get through and did go backwards and forwards. It wasn't easy, it was hard, but the overwhelming number did. And one of the reasons why the level of ships lost was so high, the level of people lost was so high, was it was often a far higher when ships were sailing on their own. And Ben is going to ask many questions about ships sailing on their own. He has his views, I have mine. I'm sure we're both citing evidence and citing things we've read and have done our own investigative research on it. So I will go through them and treat it as honestly as I can. It's a terrible loss of life, but it's also quite complicated. Because there are a lot of factors which go into a merchant seaman being lost, and convoys running, and where are the convoys, and who counts as what, and what are everyone counted on the crew. And also there is some other issues when it comes to these things. So you also have a fact that quite a lot of experienced merchant sailors and merchant navy officers were also Royal Navy Reserve. So they lose a lot of experienced people that way, actually largely to the convoy escorts. So a lot of merchant seamen, experienced merchant seamen and merchant navy officers, become convoy escorts, which is both beautiful because they understand the convoys and they understand the merchant sailors and they have a real bond with them, but also takes it out of the merchant navy. So they have to do a lot of work to upgrade the merchant navy in terms of its training and its generation of officers and people to run its ships. And one of the great triumphs, I think, of World War II is what happens in the merchant navy. It really becomes advances far in terms of its training and its development of personnel. And there are lots of different things involved in that. So that's quite a big success for World War II, I think. Right. As part of that, you have the Merchant Navy Reserve reserve pool, which produces continuity of employment and all sorts of things to help make sure the merchant sailors are being used as efficiently as possible and have access to work whenever they want it. Now, some of the figures for deaths given are 26,543 for the British Merchant Navy, 6,114 for the Indian Merchant Navy, 1,495 Merchant Navy Naval Auxiliary personnel. Canadian Merchant Navy, they were British. The Canadian Merchant Navy, 1,271. The Fishing Fleet of Britain, 878. And the Australian Merchant Navy, 441. Alongside that, there were 2,713 naval and DEMS gunners and 1,222 gunners of the Maritime Regiment Royal Artillery who also died, and at least 182 South Africans, possibly up to very nearly 150 New Zealanders. They are probably, though, counted amongst the British Merchant Navy deaths, along with the Chinese merchant sailors who were serving on British ships then. So, and potentially, this is the quite stark fact for the Battle of the Atlantic, there are potentially nearly 6,250 more merchant sailors who have died but are not commemorated. That's always a stark fact whenever you go back and read that. And I've talked about the Merchant Navy a lot over the years. I've done some lectures on it and its purpose in World War II and what it was getting up to. And it goes everywhere. It's the logistics which underpins pretty much everything. The Allied war effort is underpinned by merchant navy actions. So it matters, but they don't always get properly commemorated. Right. Now we have a huge long thread started off with hieroglyph. Germany's only smart pre-war option is not build any battleships or carriers or cruisers. And so I think because he's used CAs. This is the trouble when you start using modern phraseologies and NATO designations for past ships, because then I have to do the mental transposition in my head. And I'm getting into an old man. Instead of focusing U-boats. However, as John South then points out, even that would not have worked, as the UK would know they were building a mass amount of subs, so would start crash building escorts earlier. The UK is never going to allow the Germans to build up unanswered, and the UK could simply build 5 to 6 escorts for every sub Germany builds. For Germany to build 300 plus subs by 1939, they need to start in 1934-35, and the UK would have started building mass amounts of cheap escorts like the Flower class earlier, and can simply outproduce them by multiple factors. The UK had a massive industrial advantage. Which is true. Hieroglyph then says, John South, yes, but 1939 escorts were far less effective than 1943 escorts. No hedgehog, no convoys, low quality Aztec, the list goes on. Putting snorkels on all boats earlier would have been a good idea. Being outnumbered 3-1 by escorts doesn't matter. Your primary target is and should be slow, vulnerable freighters. Hit hard, quick, and then hide. It sucks being hunted, but with no hedgehogs, it's not a big deal. Depth charges are harassment weapons. At best, they drive a boat to the surface. On loan, they almost never kill. I'm not sure about that. U-boat depth charges do kill a fair number of submarines, and again, you have to find the enemy. Aztec isn't that bad, and also you have to think if the Royal Navy's if the submarine problem looks like it's going to be that bad, in other words, the Germans are building up that. I think the Royal Navy might have done a bit more active testing, and also you have to remember things like the Hedgehog, etc., are in development prior to World War II. So again, they would have received funding earlier on. They still might not have made it in for 1939, but they might have been around by 1940, 1941. Then Sean Matt goes, and hieroglyph. The problem is that if you focus on U-boats extensively, the escort you're going to see most prominently in 1939, 1940, before emergency orders kick in, is a Black Swan. And that is a nasty piece of work. Pretty much. The Royal Navy was ordering a fair number of those, and if they had gone on sloop production, i.e. if someone had said, no, you can't use the civilian industry, that has to be left for civilians, it would have been a mass order of sloops. And John South. Hieroglyph, you are massively overestimating the capacity of U-boats of that period. Not only that, but in the period, the deck gun was the primary weapon of the sub, not the torpedo. That was very expensive and a limited supply. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, snorkel doesn't come about. This is Dutch invention that the Germans find that really get the information on after they've invaded the Netherlands. They have sort of idea it's going on, but it's after they invaded the Netherlands. So for them to get it earlier, they'd have had to invade the Netherlands earlier, and that won't help. Expensive, not the torpedo. That was expensive and very limited supply. The vast majority of merchant ships sunk in 1939 to 1941 were not by torpedo. Having a heavy escort means the U-boats can't surface. Can't surface. The top speed of a Type 9 U-boat underwater was 7 knots. Type 7s were just as slow as that speed. They are not going to catch the convoys. Not only that, but the RN always planned on using a light carrier like Hermes as anti-sub units, but they kept getting refused funding by the Treasury. If Germany is building subs in the 30s, then the RN gets the escort carriers, and with the cash built, escorts, it's able to create hunting groups based around them, and even if they lose a few, unlike the fleet carriers, they are expendable. Very much correct. As I've talked about before, the Royal Navy does have plans for small carriers. And the trouble is that they won't get the funding for them unless they can produce a reason for it. It's why Unicorn is a forward aviation support ship. Not because the Royal Navy has a burning desire at that point to build a light fleet carrier, they think they need one, but they think they might need one in a future war to rapidly expand the carrier force for the fleet. So they want to test out the design, and the way they get that through is by HMS Unicorn. That is not going into the massive reduction in range of the that is not going into the massive reduction in range of the U-boats if they are forced to spend more time submerged. The U-boat on patrol spent the vast majority of its time surfaced. Plus, where would the Germans get the snorkels from? They were a Dutch invention that the Germans only got hold of in 1940, and even then it took over a year to be able to operate them. All true. But also, there's the fact that if the Germans start building submarines and start ramping up their production in 1934, 1933, that's going to be a lot earlier submarines they're going to have to be focusing on. Because that's their technology level is still developing. This is the point. The reason they have so few submarines in 1939 is quite simply they have been cranking them up slowly. They have been doing iterative development. Quite sensible to get a better submarine force, but it means it takes time. John Evans, reply to John South. The problem is, if Germany has no battleships or cruisers, then the Italians are going to find that nearly the full battleship strength of the Royal Navy in their backyard and are ready to make Matapan seem like a good result for the Italians. Also means that Norway can't be invaded, so the British are able to interdict the vital sea trade with Sweden. John Evans. That too, and not just the Italians. Yes, let's be honest, if the Germans don't have any battleships, then the poor Italians are going to be facing the full might of the Royal Navy. Probably fleet carriers as well. It would have a very interesting impact on World War II. Also, at a certain point, then there's what threat is there of an actual invasion of Britain? Because if Germany has nothing bigger than destroyers and submarines, then no one's going to be looking at them going, Sea Lion? Yeah, that's not going to happen. They would probably still win in France, but Norway, I don't know. There is a potential with all destroyer force they could have done it like they did, done everywhere like they did Narvik, but that's going to be a lot slower troop arrival, and it's going to be a lot more difficult. And if you focus that much on the submarines, what is your surface fleet looking like? What do your destroyers look like? Have you built your destroyers big? In other words, to be cruiser substitutes, or have you built them as coastal defense destroyers? What have you focused your destroyer fleet on? In making a decision to go for a submarine or a submarine focused fleet can have a big effect on your surface force. Because one of the reasons why you build bigger destroyers is to escort your larger surface ships. That's your justification for it. Sure, Mike. John South. I think also, while we don't have a ton of data, it does imply that more subs has diminishing returns. It's not linear, as most projections the Germans had built X number of U-boats, they would have starved the British out. All right, again, I agree, because it's the thing is, how many subs do you have available, and how many of those subs are in the right place to actually intercept the convoys? And remember, are you presuming now Britain doesn't get Enigma, that it doesn't do the trafficking analysis it was doing, which also allowed it to pick out where submarines were, all those other options? There's a lot of complicated factors which go into this. Hieroglyph, John Evans. Yeah, not having Norway is annoying, unless France collapses. Unfortunately, history also shows that even with a few battleships and cruisers, the Italians still got schooled, as in a school of fish. See, swim-wit the fish's concrete shoes. The Italians did okay. Atomic Bell. That just went into a totally different direction. Yes, it did. Hieroglyph, John South. No, I'm not. I just look into the U-boat on patrol ratios for tonnage sunk in 1940. It's impressive. Not good as 41 or 42 in terms of tonnage sunk, but in terms of kill count per boat, better. Yes, but there are a lot more ships sailing solo. You have to remember, it takes a while to wrangle everyone into convoys, and B, convince everyone sailing in convoys is necessary. And this is because some ship owners believed that their ships, because they were so much faster than submarines, they could stay out solo. Now, this was true for some of the very fast cruise liners. They could. Honestly, if a submarine could catch some of the fastest cruise liners in the world in the 1930 and World War II, they were in a very lucky position because usually it was a case of they would get one chance if they were in ambush and sitting in the right position. Otherwise, no. At John South. Plus, where would the Germans get the snorkels from? They were a Dutch invention. You do understand that much of the German U-boat arm in 1939 was designed and even manufactured by Dutch companies, right? Dutch front company and U-boat are your search terms. I agree, but there seems to be a difference between the information going to the Germans and the Dutch companies. And nice way, if that much information be going from, you would expect them to be designing with a snorkel in mind and quicker to implement the snorkel once they get it. It still takes them a year. If they'd known about it from the beginning, you'd expect them to have all the technical papers and have all the knowledge. They're not. So, as they don't in history, you can't go back and say magically, well, actually, the Dutch give it to them. You can't do that. Once you start doing that, you're not doing a logical progression of a potential what-if scenario. You're just rewriting history, in which case we're into a very nice fiction book, which I would love to read, actually, because it could be quite interesting. Mainly because I could just riff off it. Hieroglyph. We have Shawmac. We haven't had plenty of accurate data on tonnage sunk and boats on patrol. I'm unsure why you think there is data unavailable. It's all been long declassified. Shawmac. Hieroglyph. No, we don't have a lot of permutation on that data. It's difficult. It's difficult to analyze. Hieroglyph. Shawmac. If you're too lazy, that seems a bit rude. And the next phrase, next one is definitely not called for. Hieroglyph. I expect better from you. To parse and manipulate numerical data, then you need to take a course in statistics. The new raw data is all available. 2. Coercing into or from an SQA table is within the, again, don't need to use that word, capacity of a bright, hardworking high school student. Sean Mack. It's a hieroglyph. Okay, dude, what is it with hostility? I would agree, Sean Mack. Hieroglyph, you're usually better than this. Please. You can, of course, filter the data. The problem is we have only one permutation of Second World War tech level subwarfare. Can we draw a lot of conclusions from that? Yes, absolutely. But our outputs are affected by a ton of variables. Frankly, I am insulted that you would imply that I'm too lazy or unintelligent for stats, which is my favorite mathematical discipline, by the way. Hieroglyphs response. Sure, my favorite discipline is none of them. They all sucked. I can understand. But Paul was the worst of the lot? Oh, favorite disciple. Oh, going into Christianity now. Again, just being rude. Hieroglyph. I expect better from you. Shomak, by the way, there was another U-boat war, but that one was in the Pacific, with different tactics and boats, so you actually have at least 3 sets. 4 if you include Italy, with a substantial submarine force, including large ocean vessels, and the most effective manned torpedoes. Plus, you have the British in the Mediterranean, which we've been talking about for a while. The British do quite well in the Mediterranean, but all of them have variable different tactics. And the Dutch even get involved in things. Hieroglyph. That is true, but they're often on apples and oranges. The closest is the Pacific, of course, and actually have to pass that data, but there are huge issues with interpreting that data in terms of what I'm looking for. My theory being that the effect of submarines' deployment numbers isn't linear, as is often supposed in these projections, and that there are diminishing returns because of the issues with the Mark 14. The data doesn't fit into the set in useful way. Plus, also the fact that the Japanese and the Japanese and running convoys is a interesting scenario. The Japanese do get into it and do, as I've talked about recently, have convoy escort carriers, but it's a problem. While I understand encouraging people to pursue these kinds of things rather than saying the answer isn't easily Googleable, so who knows, you came off incredibly aggressive and unkind. I would agree with Sean Mack. Hieroglyph, I expect better from you in future. You're usually one of the most interesting commenters, and I like looking forward to your comments. I'm not sure what was going on that day, but do better. John South, Hieroglyph. Yes, but the Dutch companies didn't give the schnorkels. The first schnorkel the Germans ever saw was the one from a Dutch submarine they captured in 1940. The subs being 025 and 026. Even with the captured Dutch schnorkels, the first German schnorkel was on U-58 in June 1943. So I repeat, where did the Germans get the snorkels from? And Stuart Wald. Germany had a choice of 2 different Z plans. One for an early war based on armed merchant raiders, Atlantis-Edel, Panzerschiffen and submarines, and the plan actually ordered by Hitler for a balanced heavy fleet to be ready in 1944-45. Leaving aside the issue of whether Germany would actually have built the heavy fleet of that Z plan, they probably wouldn't, It was totally thrown off kilter by the war starting in 1939, by the same guy who told Admiral Rader that he had years to get ready. He also did the same thing to the Royal Navy's plans, the USN's plans, everyone's plans. That man just ruins a load of naval plans. Just think of the ships. Think of the ships we have lost thanks to that man. Also, the millions of people he killed, which is even worse. But speaking of someone at the moment discussing the ship side of it, it's really annoying losing those ships because it would have been cool. If the Kriegsmarine was to be built in the mid-late 1930s, after the Anglo-German Accord, for a war before 1940, they would have had a lot more submarines than they actually had at the start of war. Of course, the force would have been unbalanced, but it would have been the best that could have been done. Also, throwing in more integrated long-range air search assets. Think more Red Storm Rising than the Napoleonic efforts. True. Andrew Cox. Unless France falls, which probably wasn't in any naval plans pre-war, I've discussed this already, do any naval options actually make sense? Yes, your super-fast cruisers could be an interesting option, but you still have to get through the North Sea, and 40 knots is still slow compared to strike fighters or even swordfish. Even then, given that the planned opponent was France, the super-fast cruisers wouldn't make much sense, unless they take on contre-torpilleers. To be point, the planned opponent was always Britain. That was always the threat they were talking about in terms of naval terms. And the reason I'm suggesting that fast cruisers are the option to go is that fast 40 knot 6-inch cruisers could probably hug the coast of Norway quite well and race up and out, even without the controlled Norway. And once into the Atlantic, if they have enough range, they can do a lot of damage. And the thing is, if you've built enough of them, you can have them forward deployed and forward support them. And you can forward support a 6-inch cruiser forward more easily than you can a Panzerschiffen. It's an incredibly complicated beast, and 11-inch guns do not help matters. 11-inch guns are far more complicated and difficult to maintain than 6-inch guns. Especially if you're just carrying 6 of them, which is all you need for that. Whereas the 11-inch, no. So, 3 double turrets. The odds are you only ever need to use 1 turret at a time to deal with a merchant ship. The only reason you have 3 turrets is so you can look like you're seemingly something more viable than a merchant ship counter and killer. Andrew Cox, even with your super-fast cruiser, I see your convoy and I have 6 6-inch guns and can do 40 knots. I am a county town Crown Colony class cruiser and you have to come to me. Yes, it is. But the thing is, the Royal Navy then has to build a lot more cruisers to factor you in. And the thing is, building cruisers... how do I put this? The biggest threat to sloops and the escort destroyers, which are used for the convoys, is a cruiser level ship. That could race in and cause a huge amount of damage to them quite quickly. One of those hits a convoy, it could wipe out the escorts, and especially in the early years of the war. So yes, you would have to have a cruiser with them, but that means you can't have a cruiser doing everything else. And you only have so many cruisers. And remember, cruisers are your present ships. They're your fighting ships in the Mediterranean. They are your critical convoy, heavy ships, of course, and all other things, going around the world. They are critical to your task groups. They're critical to your pickets against larger surface raiders and, of course, against these surface raiders. The Royal Navy, it has a shortage of cruisers. It's a well-known fact. The Royal Navy's talking about it in the 1930s. In a nice way, if you want to play into the Royal Navy's paranoia, you build something which is going to require a lot of cruisers to cover around. It's going to absolutely scare them. It's also going to cause problems, if you think about it, when they're making a decision about what to cover, what to build. Because if you're dealing with such a cruiser force, what do? You cannot make the choice of, We will stop capital ships and carriers. The latter was not sensible, as said. The Admiralty argued against it, or everyone argued against it, because carriers were such a part of the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare doctrine. But it was a decision made by government. And you stop, to an extent, you pause cruisers as well to concentrate on building escorts. If you know Germany has all these little these little cruisers wandering around, fudge, you can't pause cruisers. And what other ships are you building? One of the interesting things, though, is would a King George V come out looking far more like a battle cruiser than a fast battleship, if that's the threat they're looking at in terms of the North Atlantic? Or would they still be thinking about the Italians and the Japanese while building their battleships? Siwaji 90. One cannot really win a naval war with pure commerce raiding. It's a strategy that comes from position of weakness. True. Bill Bolton. As far as cost-effective threat to cause resources to be diverted to dealing with them, the U-boat makes sense. The only hope of winning would be to concentrate on technology and try to build up a large number without being discovered, and hopefully cause enough losses and panic early on. Although starting the British out of the war was always going to be an unrealistic goal. True. Rick Vasala, thank you. George Crab, can you do one of these on Japan's Kantai-Kessen doctrine? Hi, George. I gave George a nice link to the one I did on the Kantai-Kessen doctrine. Thank you, Eric Arkan. David Tronso. Really, all of Hitler's military ventures were crackpot schemes. He took advantage of British and French malaise and Stalin's greed to get what he wanted early on, but like all gamblers, his and Germany's luck eventually ran out. True. Aeon 1000, well, I think it's 10,003. Grand strategy wasn't used in Germany at the time. It was, it just wasn't listened to. John Evans. One huge issue for the Germans is that the single U-boat can't do enough damage to an escorted convoy, so they have to shadow, form a group, and don its light to control a lot sentry. So that all means a lot of communication is needed, and Britain has made huge investments in signal detection, so they are often betraying their presence. Yes. And as Hashim says, good point, and it applies much today. That's true. That's the traffic analysis was a key point in working out where the threats were. Brain pause. Dr. Glass, I was curious, were the squids deployed early enough to see significant use during war? My response to that was they were deployed on 70 ships by the end of World War II, so they did okay, but really the Hedgehog did the work. SW Motors. Ben Wilson. Dr. Clarke, I'm afraid you're wrong about the Flower-class corvettes. They were ordered, I think, in June 1939. The first was commissioned in April 1940. The convoy protection was a blind spot in the Royal Navy's planning. Okay, I'd end up doing a whole video about this because Ben keeps coming back. But here's my response. The design of them was ordered in the NC in 1938. The hull was selected in January 1939. The first orders were with the yards were placed in July 1939. Hope that explains it. Plus, remember, it was not that long since the 10-year rule had been quietly dropped, and the RM was operating under strategic belief of war not coming hopefully until 1942. The 10-year rule had been quietly dropped in 1932. In which case, these ships start delivering in 1940 would have been a great pre-war build-up. Plus, there was the Black Swan class, started in design in 1936, ordered in 1937. Then there was the Bassett class trawlers, which were first ordered in 1935. The Iron kicked off its trawler procurement even earlier, see. So, no, sorry, convoy protection was not a blind spot, it just wasn't ready in time. If war had started out 3 years later, we'd be writing how well prepared the Royal Navy was, instead of people who keep saying caught unawares again, when just a quick look in the order book shows otherwise. Anyway, hope that helps. Dr. Clarke. Maybe you need to explain that to the families of the merchant ships lost on unescorted crossings. Trawlers were not able for the Atlantic crossings. Trawlers did do the Atlantic crossings. I'm sorry, Ben, but there are pictures of them doing it, and they did it. Yes, they were usually the bigger trawlers, which might be called whalers, but there were trawlers which do. And they mostly did the coastal convoys as well, which were actually where a lot of the merchant ships were lost. A lot of the heaviest losses were on the merchant convoys going around the coast. So we often associate the transatlantic and think of that as the real killing point for the merchant ships lost in World War II, and those figures I gave you out earlier. But when you look into it, you find that the coastal convoys, especially the East Coast convoys, are probably the most dangerous part of their mission and their operation. So they'd come in across the Atlantic. They'd reach Liverpool usually. That's where they Usually, often brought the convoys in, and from there they'd attach themselves to ships to coastal convoys. Because even with the railway network and the road network, it was still a lot easier and a lot more efficient to move the goods around the UK by ship. And they would go off round Scotland and come down the coast that way. Some of them would go off down the Irish Sea, round Cornwall, and along the southern coast to the ports down there. The whole way through World War II, this was going on. And the coastal convoys are, they face the full gambit. They get submarines. When we're talking about the coastal submarines of the German Navy, there's a reason they're building them. The Type 23s and all the previous vessels, they are infesting the British coast. That's what they're after. That's where Schnellboots, or what's usually called E-boats, come involved, and German aircraft as well. Those convoys around the coast of the UK suffered from the full force of the German military might. And in many ways, they were more exposed and more damaged than the ones in Atlantic. Because in Atlantic, you have a great big ocean to disappear to. Along the coast of the UK, well, it's kind of predictable which way you're going. Hi, Ben. At no point have I not said that happened. I was just saying that the British government had anticipated it and started preparations much earlier in the 1930s, rather than the crash building programme, which is as it is often presented. I also said that as the focus of this was the strategy for Germany, it was not a winning one. I'm sorry if you wish to blame Churchill, and if we go there, I think I didn't continue things. Trawls were not. Many were lost. This is back to Ben Wilson's comment. Many were lost. There was a cunning plan. If you were a merchant navy sailor officer, when the ship was sunk, you were off your wages until you next join a ship. Dead, injured, prisoner of war, your family was left destitute. That is one reason why the prisoners of the Outmark cheered at being rescued. Maybe if Churchill was so worried about the loss of ships, he would have sorted that out. Now, again, I will point to the various things the British that they set up and they tried on this ones, and they even did have, as I think I've talked about, they did start various programs, and I mentioned I think the pool which they used for those things to try and help and iron out these issues. Anyway, here's my response. Hi Ben, at no point I've said that happened. That paragraph. I'm sorry if you wish to blame Churchill or anyone really for those losses on the British side. If they are the fault of anything, it's that they were probably a year or 18 months too late starting in their preparations. With a legacy of World War One less than 20 years gone at time, being a little blinded by the desire for no repeat makes sense. The key point of both of these videos is that it takes time. They start working on the specifications for the Flower class in 1938, based on the experience of several soup classes built in the 1920s and 1930s. It was the same with the Hunt class. Hence, they were able to make selections and orders relatively early in 1939, well before war broke out, or even when war looked likely. As I've said elsewhere, in January 1939, war was more likely to start with Japan than Germany, with ships actually pointing guns at each other, the Tsingtao incident. And yet still, with the need to convoy merchant ships, they pushed ahead. Now, you could come back with the argument, as there was no treaty restrictions on the number of sloops built, as long as they were accorded with speed, weapons, and individual displacement requirements, that the Admiralty should have been matching destroyer build with sloop build each year from 1928 onwards. I would support you on this, but the government made the financial decision not to, relying upon superior water and maritime infrastructure to allow for rapid build-up when war came. However, that was the decision of multiple governments, long before Winston Churchill became Lord of Admiralty, let alone Prime Minister. Now, John Evans then pointed out, Dr. Clarke, the 10-year rule, I seem to remember Churchill being guilty of something related to that, or I'm misremembering. He was involved in the first beginning of the 10-year rule. He was campaigning for its ending long before it was ended, though. And, yeah, Ben, if... The thing you are pointing out wrong when you're talking about all these things is you're going on, they have no plan. They do have a plan. As I said, though, you're attacking the wrong thing. The thing is, they could have been building more sloops. They are building sloops in all those years, but they're building them in threes and fours. As I think I've said in other videos, they should have been building 8 to 12 a year. That's what they should have done. They should have been building 8 to 12 a year, maybe even 16 to 18, i.e., the same number as if they're building 2 flotillas of destroyers, build 2 flotillas of sloops. And if you're starting off building, let's say, 18 a year, and you start off in 1928, then by 1939, considering they take about a year to 18 months to enter service, if you've been ordering 18 a year, you'll have had them coming in from the second year pretty much constantly. And so from 1929 to 1939, that's roughly 10 years, so you'd have had 180 sloops ready to go. The thing is, if the Royal Navy had been building 180 sloops in that period, I'm fairly sure other nations would have taken notice. What they could have exactly done about it is nothing. But it would have been interesting to see what the 1930 and 1936 naval treaties turned out like if the Royal Navy was building that many sloops. People could have thought they accused Britain of trying to get destroyers by the back door or something else, but they'd have probably designed them so quite good. And as you can see, this is the Black Swans were fifth generation sloops. You'd have probably got to something similar then within 5-6 years. So probably have started building something along the lines of a Black Swan by 1935, 34 maybe, if you're lucky. In which case you could have had goodness knows what available by World War II beginning. Come, Gashberg. The Drachenfell plan. I have a feeling, as this is getting quite so long, I'm going to break this. I was going to do all three in one video. I'm going to break this up into 3 videos, I think. Yes, having 2 Koenig tigers means you treat them as Easter eggs, but when you have 5 plus panthers, oh, they're good enough, and we can risk 1 or 2 of them. We can have a pair at sea, a pair in Brest, another pair in Norway, and 1 of them are ready to sail. At least 1 of them. Even building 2 with 9 11-inch guns in 3 treble turrets, and the rest with 6 15-inch guns in 3 double turrets would do. Pretty much it would. Colonel Gasworth, battle cruisers as frigates makes sense because many battle cruisers were Brazade battleships. That, as I said, I think that's discussing the fact that one of the original names considered for the battle cruiser was frigate. Wayne Boring, I've been off on the opinion for a while now that I'm both ears. The German I've been of the opinion for a while now that I'm both ears. The Germans should have gone for a Baltic fleet. They had the resources for. I also wonder if resources used in Battle Atlantic would have been more useful in Russia. Possibly, but the Battle Atlantic was their go-to to try and influence Britain and threaten Britain. Aeon 10,003 is the Sherman tank the end of history? T-shirt. Seawinish. Again, gotta say that war is by definition a gambit. If you stay home, you certainly do not win. And after 1940, what chance would a German surface raider force have had? Virtually none. Subs were by far the best choice for them considering the possibilities and lack of air support. They tried and they lost. They killed double the number of Allied sailors that they lost. They sank 10 times the tonnage that they lost. I'm not quite sure about those figures. The casualties officially for the Battle Atlantic are 36,200 sailors killed, 36,000 merchant sailors killed. So that is roughly 72,000 sailors lost. Okay, and it's supposedly roughly 30,000 U-boat sailors killed. There are a lot of various interesting things added into this. Roughly 500 Italians killed. Well, yeah. It could be right. And it probably is, but it seems a bit low for me on the Germans being killed. But I suppose if they're just including the submarines as the Battle Atlantic, that Okay, that's probably right. They're just including the submarines. But I'm not sure. And that's the last question, I think. The German surface radar force in after 1940. Well, if the war had turned out, those cruisers would have been large enough ships they could have probably accomplished Norway with. Small enough ships they could have accomplished Norway with, viably. And if they've got Norway and they've got those cruisers operating out of Norway and operating out of France, which they could forward base them and not worry about them because they'd have a lot of them, because you could build a lot of them. Basically, I'm offering you the Panzer IV option. In that it's a good enough tank if you concentrated on making it as easy to produce as possible and shoved them out the door, you would probably have fairly decent armoured forces for most of World War II, capable of dealing with most of the threats that you come your way. But the Germans don't. I don't know. So, that was the redo of the Battle Atlantic and me going through and answering comments. I hope it helped. I hope it's interested you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this right back to the beginning. And at some point tomorrow, I'm going to record the original and the responses to the Battle Atlantic escorts. And I'm just going to add again, for those who've watched the whole way through, thank you very much for watching. Hope you liked. If you do like, please subscribe. I'm saying that for two reasons. One, I genuinely like people subscribing and especially pressing the bell down there so they join me when I'm live, because then I have more people to chat to. And I like chatting to people, especially about history. But also, as you know, because of the bet I now have with my aunt, because I would really, really like to see her wearing a Blackburn face mask. And she's been a real trooper at it. She's already ordered them, but she just doesn't think she's ever going to have to put them in. She says she's planning on not opening them to see if she can return them in January. I'm hoping she doesn't get to. So, please, share, subscribe. Get as many people as you like, as you know, to share and subscribe, because there is bragging rights on the line. Thank you.